education. We do not like to be records police, and we don't like to be authoritarian. So just let us know what's going on, and if you have questions, and we will, answer them. So the first thing I always like to start with is, I'm going to trip over this cord. Hold on. There we go. We're good. I always like to talk about our records management staff and kind of why we do these outreach trainings now. If you look at this picture, this was the public records staff back in 1987. This is, you'll notice that there are a lot of people in that picture. Most of those people had something to do with public records in one way or another. They either processed collections for us, they went out to agencies and did appraisals, they managed all sorts of things. Well, now it's me, Ethan, and Mark. That's the public records division. So we are in charge of helping agencies manage records for the entire executive branch, all 105 counties, every single office within every single 100 of those counties. And then we operate as kind of an advisor or a consultant for cities and municipalities. So we're busy, but we do these trainings so that we can give you guys the tools that you need to manage your own records, or give you the tools that you need to be able to look for answers to questions that you may have. So we're going to start today by just talking a little bit about some definitions in the records management world. These are things that Ethan and I talk about all the time. I like to start off the presentation with this so that everybody's on the same playing field, because we don't like to throw words out that people don't understand. And we're going to talk about series, schedule, disposition, and retention today. First, a series is just a group of similar records that are arranged according to a filing system. So think of permit files, think of complaint files, things like that. They're not each individual paper, but a group of things that are alike. So when you're looking at retention schedules and when you're creating these things, you're not scheduling each individual piece of paper or electronic file that you're touching separately, because that would be a nightmare and a disaster. So we try to group things into series and schedule things according to that. A schedule is just the process of identifying and describing records. So these are the things that it's the defining document of what you can and can't do with your records. It tells you how long you have to keep things, what you can do with them when you're done, all that good stuff. Disposition is just what happens to the records when you're done with them, or if you are done with them. The state only recognizes 3 different types of disposition. We recognize destroy, permanent, or archive. For cities, that's a little different because we don't act as the official archive for local governments typically. Depends on what the record is. We do take some local government records in, but archive could mean a local historical society, a local library, something like that. But those are the 3 that we recognize at the state. And then retention is just the length of time you have to keep something. So those are the 4 words we're going to use all the time. Ethan and I talk about these every day of our lives that we work. I joke that I dream about it sometimes. He thinks I'm crazy. Yeah, I know. So then we get into the life cycle of records. We're going to talk about the life cycle quite a bit, using each one of these little blocks as we go. Ethan's going to go into a little bit more depth about what this means for you and for the state. But I just kind of want to point out that all we mean when we talk about the life cycle of records is just what happens to your records. At what point is it a record? How do you use these things like that. So if you follow the line here, it's just creation, receipt of the record, maintaining and using it, and then you hit your disposition point. That's all a records management life cycle is. When you're looking at this, though, at the very end, those are your disposition points, right? You have your permanent, your transfer archives, and your destroy. Really only 5%, and that's even a high number, should be kept permanently or sent to the archives. That's something that was laid out by the National Archives. It's an a profession standard that we have. And we're actually doing a pretty good job of doing that at the archives. So everything, if you take into consideration everything that state agencies and county governments create, we really only archive about 5% of that. Now, that doesn't mean that records aren't important. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't maintain them during the life cycle of the record. It just means that only 5% have historical, long-lasting value. So now that we're kind of on the same page here, Ethan is going to jump in and talk to you a little bit about what records management means for Kansas and why we're involved. He's got a fun story for you, which I'm excited about. And then I'll come back later and talk a little bit more about electronic records. Good?
Okay, so we're in the state of Kansas, so why not talk about records management in the state of Kansas? Now, to start out with, what exactly is a government record? To put simply, it's every single thing that you guys use on a daily basis. It can be Word documents, paper files, audiovisual tapes, microfilm. Any of that stuff is a record in the state of Kansas. The important part here is format doesn't really matter. If you talk to Megan or me enough, you're going to hear us use the phrase that we're format agnostic. That simply means that we don't care if you're keeping something electronically or if you're keeping something in paper form, just so long as you're keeping the records. That's really the most important part. Now, why am I so confident in saying that all this stuff is a record? We thankfully have a statute that says that exact same thing. So KSA 45402 spells out all volumes, documents, reports, maps, drawings, charts, indexes, everything is a record. And the important part here is regardless of physical form or characteristics, again, everything you use on a daily basis is a record. So why is this stuff important? To begin with, well, we're in a democracy, and for a democracy to function effectively, we have to have accountability of our elected officials. And the way that we do this is through government transparency. So what you guys do on a daily basis is important for democracy to function. Being in a government too, we're always worried about cost. We're always worried about providing things effectively for as low of a cost as possible. And if you do effective records management, you're going to be able to meet that. We want to protect these records as well. At the Historical Society, we're not trying to keep these things for 5, 10, 20 years. We want to, theoretically at least, keep them forever. We want to keep them as long as we possibly can. A good part of that too, or part of that is with security. You guys might have, documents that have social security numbers on them, medical history. We have stuff like adoption records, mental health files, and obviously we can't just be giving that away to everyone who walks in the door. We have to have some measure of security to make sure that people don't have access to that. This is also going to be important if you're trying to transition, if you're making things electronic, if you're trying to go to a paper-light or paperless environment. It's easier to know how to organize things on your shared drives or that sort of thing if you know what records you have to begin with and how they're organized in paper format. And then lastly, all this stuff is important because it's the law. There are four laws in Kansas that deal with records management. I'm not going to get into details in these. It's just important to know that do not delete or destroy documents if you don't have authority to do so. And the things that do give you the authority to do that are retention schedules. If something says keep 3 years, don't be destroying it after 1 year, because you can get in a lot of trouble if you do that. So just keep in mind, you have to have the authority from a retention schedule in order to destroy something. Also, these aren't your own personal documents. They belong to the city of Andover, or if you work for the county, they belong to the county. They belong to the government of Kansas. They're not your own personal documents, even though you created them and work with them on a daily basis. Now, about this time in the presentation, I get kind of sick of talking about statutes, and I get sick of talking about definitions and everything. So I'm a historian by training, and so I like to tie everything back to something that has happened in history. And if you know me, I can pretty much do that with anything. So we're going to be talking about pirates quickly, and where records management has come into practice historically. And I know this seems like this doesn't tie in at all, but just wait, and it will. I promise. So We're not going to be talking about pirates just generally speaking. We're going to be talking about one guy in particular, Captain William Kidd. Now, Kidd has kind of gone down in history as one of, the most bloodthirsty, notorious, infamous pirates who's ever sailed the seven seas. And this is often how, history books portray him nowadays. The fact of the matter is, the guy looked a lot like this. He's kind of looks like a Scottish nobleman or that sort of thing. Now, Kidd was a privateer in the second half of the 17th century, which means he sails around the world protecting British interests from the French and from pirates. And as a privateer, he's given a ton of leeway to do this. While he's, out privateering, he captures a ship called the Quedagh Merchant off the coast of Madagascar. The Quedagh Merchant is, I believe, an Indian vessel, but it doesn't really matter because it has what's called a French pass. Now, what this is just a letter from the French king that says, while this ship is on the seven seas, while it's in business, the French will protect it. That's all that this pass means. And so, because privateers are given so much leeway during this time, this is good enough. It pretty much means that the ship is French, or at least is close enough by, the means of the day. Now, shortly after Kidd captures the Quedagh Merchant, he hears that he's wanted for piracy. So being the good guy that he is, he decides to turn himself in. And when he turns himself in, he turns in, all of his maps, charts, documents, records, as well as this French pass. Now, he's quickly put on trial for piracy. Pretty much everyone that he's ever known blames him for every act of piracy in the last 30 years. All of his friends, benefactors abandon him, and it's, a complete political circus. The one thing that Kidd has on his side to, show that he's, a legitimate privateer and not a pirate is this French pass, showing that the Quedagh Merchant, was a legitimate vessel. Unfortunately, when it comes to the trial, no one can find this French pass. He gave it over to the authorities, and they promptly lost it. And so because of that, Kidd really doesn't have anything to his defense. He's put on trial, and he's quickly found guilty of piracy and hanged. Now, it is not until the year 1910, over 200 years after Kidd is put on trial, that an American researcher at the Public Records Office in Great Britain does in fact stumble upon this French pass. It was there all along. Someone either decided, to purposely misfile this, or was just so incompetent that no one could find this document for 200 years. And so the reason that I like to kind of point this story out is that things that you guys do on a daily basis are really important. Things like labeling things properly, filing things properly, they can have huge impacts later on down the road. In this instance, a possible innocent man was hanged and has gone down as one of the most notorious pirates ever, and he could have been completely innocent. The one thing that Kidd doesn't have going for him, that you guys and everyone else in Kansas has going for you, is Megan and me. So we are going to try our best to make sure that none of you hang, no matter how incompetent you may be at your job. Megan always hates when I say that because it puts a lot of pressure on us, but I feel like it's something we can manage. So where do Megan and I kind of stand in the whole grand scheme of things? We're really the liaisons between the State Records Board and local and state government agencies. So really, if anyone has an issue, if anyone wants to create a retention schedule, they first go through Megan and me. We'll kind of vet it, make sure everything makes sense, and then we'll present it to the State Records Board. You guys, if you're a city, you're not required to present any new retention schedules to the State Records Board. It might be a good idea to, though. They do have a lot of experience. If you don't want to vet it through them, you can at least vet it through us. Megan and I are here to help you guys out in whatever way that we can. So I want to give you guys just a little bit of information on the State Records Board, the Electronic Records Committee, in case you do want to present something to them, just so you're a little more comfortable and have some familiarity with both of these organizations. So the State Records Board is comprised of 5 members. It's someone from the Attorney General's Office, Department of Administration, the State Librarian, someone from the Historical Society, and the State Archivist. They typically meet quarterly. Their next meeting is going to be next week, And then after that, they'll be meeting in January. So again, they're here to really provide guidance for you. I'd like to point out on this previous slide, all the arrows in this slide point up. It's not a top-down organization in the state of Kansas. All of the local government agencies, you guys know your records better than we do. So we really leave it up to you to create retention schedules that fit your needs. So the State Records Board is never going to be forcing retention schedules down your throat. It's really up to you to create things that are going to work for your agency. Now, if you do want to present something to the State Records Board, we just ask that you give us a little bit of time to work with you. That's really all this slide is here for. If you have, more than 10 retention schedules that you want to present, we just, generally speaking, ask that you give us a month or so to, make sure everything makes sense in those retention schedules. If it's, 1 or 2, we can probably get it done 2 or 3 weeks out, that sort of thing. There's also the Electronic Records Committee, which is a subcommittee of the State Records Board, and it's really tech heavy. We have lots of IT from different organizations in it, and so the main difference here is that if you're presenting something to the Electronic Records Committee, which again you guys don't have to do, it may be a good idea to though, you may want to consult them, is they really focus on documents that are going to be kept electronically at some point and that are going to be kept for longer than 10 years. So part of that is an electronic record keeping plan, which is just a big plan that says lots of tech heavy stuff. So it's going to go over, if you're keeping these electronic records in a database, what kind of database is it, or what kind of system are you using? How often are backups made? Who has access to that information? Is there, a disaster recovery plan in place in case something goes wrong? So they really just, the whole point of these ERPs is to make sure that you're asking yourself all the hard questions so that, these documents will survive longer than 10 years. And again, the timeline for this is really similar to the State Records Board. We just ask that you, generally give us about a month to go over everything and make sure that things make sense. The ERC last met they always meet a month prior to the State Records Board, so they last met in September, and their next meeting will be coming up in December. All right, so if you have some retention schedules, where can you find them? So we have a handy dandy website for that, so I'm going to show you guys where you can find them. All right, so this is the Kansas State Historical Society's website, kshs.org, and all the retention schedules that we have are located under this top tab called Public Records. And if you hover over it and under Records Retention Schedules, you just have to go to Search. So fairly easy. And then this site is going to pop up, this page. And if you go down to the bottom, under local or county, there's going to be really 2 schedules that apply to every different agency. The general schedule, and then we also have more agency-specific schedules. For example, if you're a county clerk, we have a different schedule for you there. I just want to bring up the general schedule so you guys get an idea of what some of these look like. My apologies if this is kind of hard to read. All right. So for example, let's just look at the first one, accident reports. So all retention schedules are going to have a title, a series ID, and then if the title is not, if it doesn't tell you enough information, it's going to have a description, just, making sure that you can figure out what exactly these records are. It's also going to have a retention period. So for example, with accident reports, it's clear that you have to keep these 5 calendar years. There may be a comment section depending on how difficult these things are, not always though. And then it's going to clearly list out the disposition, again, either permanent, archives, or destroy in this case. You may see some restrictions with these as well, and then an approval date, and then the KAR number. is really not that important. It just shows what meeting of the State Records Board this was passed. So we're on, I think 202 or something right now. So it's basically just another approval date. So it's nothing to be too worried about. Do I have any questions on any of that? There's going to be a quiz later, so if you don't speak up now, I'll find out who is paying attention. Okay. Here we go. All right. So just some things to keep in mind. We do make changes to the general schedule from time to time. In recent memory, we've made some changes to both grant files and budget files, and we will be making more changes along the line. So the real reason I put this slide up here is I don't want you to go to the general schedule, print these off, and then use them for the next 40 years thinking, everything's up to date. You can maybe, check back every year or 2 years just to make sure, nothing has changed. Okay. Now, I'd like to remind you guys of how do these benefit you? What's in it for you? What have retention schedules done for you lately? And so the benefits that they have, the main one is, as long as you're following retention schedules, you are absolutely in compliance with records law. If you ever get a core request or anything like that, as long as you are following retention schedules to the T, you don't have to worry whatsoever because you're doing everything that the law requires you to do. Excuse me. It's also going to help you identify and protect records. As long as you're, practicing good records management, you shouldn't have these, random boxes of crap that no one knows what they are. Things should be, labeled properly. You shouldn't have to go rummaging through unknown boxes trying to figure out what they are. It's also going to help you to minimize storage requirements. If something on the retention schedule says to keep these records for 3 years and you have them for 60 years, go ahead and get rid of the other 57 years. The retention schedule only says 3, so you only have to keep it for 3. The nice thing about that too is if you do have a core request and you have documents that you're only supposed to be keeping for 3 years and you have them for 60, you have to turn over all 60 years. You have to turn over all pertinent documents that you have, no matter if it follows the retention schedule or not. So just make your lives easier and follow all the retention schedules. Also, if you have some of these documents that you only need to be keeping for 3 and you have them for 60 and you think there's some, historical value or to them, feel free to contact your local historical society, your local library, see if maybe they want to keep some of these documents. Obviously, they may not be interested in it, but feel free to, reappraise these, see if anyone else wants them before going ahead and destroying them. So if you want to create or revise a retention schedule, kind of what are some steps to do that? The first one really is just figure out what these documents are. What purpose do they serve? Also, are these records in paper form? Are they electronic? They could be both too. Perhaps some of these records, were in paper form up until 1996, and then you switched over to electronic records. That's totally fine. Also, how long do these need to be maintained? Think of this as from, both like a business practice. For example, if you have receipts and you only have to worry about audits for a year, it probably doesn't make sense to keep these for 10 years or that sort of thing. Again, if you're keeping something electronically and for over 10 years, it may be a good idea to fill out an electronic record keeping plan. You guys at the cities don't have to, but again, you might just think about doing that in the long run. And again, consult other retention schedules. If you're working for the city clerk, figure out what the county clerks are doing. Figure out what the city clerks in Wichita are doing or something like that. There's no real reason to reinvent the wheel on a lot of this stuff. Work smarter, not harder. Okay, and the first step, if you want to create a retention schedule or if you want to change something that you have, is just consult your records officer. If They may be able to help you. If they, don't really know exactly what's going on, feel free to contact Megan or me. We do work with a lot of state agencies and a lot of counties, but that doesn't mean that, we're too busy or don't have time for you guys. We're here to help you in any way that we possibly can. Okay. And then just some quick kind of clarifications or classifications, excuse me. In the archives world, we really cut things down into 3 different time periods that you need to keep something. So there's short-term records, which just need to be kept temporarily. Short-term in the archival world is under 10 years. There's also keeping things in the long term, which is over 10 years, but obviously not permanently. A good example of things that need to be kept in the long term are things like employee personnel records. If you're with an agency, for 10 years or for 50 years, no matter how long you're with that agency, they should have a personnel file on you. But even if you're there 50 years, they may keep it 2 years after and then destroy it. So it could be kept a really long time, but obviously, again, not permanently. An example of things that are kept in the short term are things like, spam mail, convenience copies, that sort of thing. Things that are kept permanently are things with lasting significance. We like to keep things that, kind of give us a window into how an agency makes day-to-day decisions, how it operates day-to-day. And so things that we want to keep permanently are things like minutes, policies, annual reports, that sort of thing. Now these won't exactly apply to you guys quite so much. If you're making some housekeeping edits, all you have to do is contact Megan and me. This is really for state agencies and county governments. But again, we have the authority to make minor decisions. And then if you're making more substantial changes, if you work for a county or something, then you want to consult the State Records Board.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why is it that you guys, what makes the municipality different than the county or the state?
I believe it's because counties are considered executive agencies or executive level agencies.
Sort of.
Okay.
There's really not a great answer to that question. It comes down to staff. And when record statute was put into place, we didn't have enough staff to really facilitate that entire process. So if you think about all 105 counties and all the cities and municipalities that exist within that, we can't sustain with 2 archivists on staff all of that. So they put us as advisory status instead, which is kind of a bad deal for y'all because you're still held to Cora, you're still held to all of the same standards that everybody else is, but you don't get the benefit of being able to pass the buck on to the State Records Board, right? So that's why we suggest still going to them, and they won't ever approve a retention schedule for you, but they can give you advice on a retention schedule if you work for a city. And they can, we can put it in our official minutes that they have looked at it. This is something that they've agreed looks good. And then you have that extra kind of padding there. So there's really not a great answer other than we don't have people. Yeah.
And just the last thing that I want to mention before we go into our big quiz is look out for things in old retention schedules that you want to avoid. For example, if you have any references to, tapes or something like that, old technology that you guys don't use, feel free to, when you're reappraising these, to take all that stuff out and make it pertinent, make it, up to date. Okay, so I'm going to see who is paying attention today. I'll help you through these, and there's obviously not a grade or anything, so. Okay, I apologize if you can't see this very well. But I just want some participation. Is there anything in this example that is weird or doesn't make sense to you? These are all retention schedules that we currently have up on our website, which I hate saying. We're trying to change some of these, but is there anything weird that doesn't make sense to you guys in this first example? Okay. Okay. You're on the right track with the no disposition. Yes. It has a question mark in here. I hate this one so much. It drives me crazy. There should never be a question mark in the comments section. Retain for 9 years, and then I have no idea. I'm supposed to know what's going on, and I have no idea what's going on with this. I don't know if you're supposed to destroy these at the end of 9 years, if you're supposed to send them to the archives at the end of 9 years. No one really knows. The other thing that I like pointing out with these, anyone have any idea what OES stands for? I certainly don't. And so, a description on these would be really helpful, just to spell out what exactly these records are.
I'd like to point out that this was approved in 1987, and I was 3 years old.
I
I
had
did
no
not
idea
do
what they were doing in 1987.
I did not do this.
I might have been a little older than OES was Office of Emergency Services, and
Oh, okay.
believe they don't exist anymore.
That's
Okay.
very true, probably. I mean,
Yeah.
there are a lot on the schedule that
That's good
for
to
offices
know.
that don't exist anymore.
All right, thank you. Okay, example number 2, gas pro ration summaries. Is there anything weird in this one?
Exactly.
Yes. Curt, I assume means current, but still I have no idea what that means. If something's current, it still needs a retention period. I don't know if these things are current for 3 months or 30 years, and then who knows? So yes, the retention period on this should say something more than current. It should have a retention period, a time period that, after it meets that, it should be destroyed. Excellent work. Okay, this one's going to be a little tricky. Attorneys' litigation files. Is there anything weird on this one? All right, no one said anything, and that's the right answer.
Yep.
Attorneys are pretty smart. Generally, they have good retention schedules. So yeah, this one's completely fine.
Ethan used to be a teacher, and he likes gotcha moments with his students.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind.
Okay. Example number 4, complaint files. Is there anything strange in this one? This one's a little tricky too. This one's a little difficult, so if you don't get anything, that's fine. But there isn't something wrong with this. Yeah, again, I'm
Kinda
sorry.
hard to read.
What's useful? Who defines useful?
Okay, that's good. Well, we're trying to kind of steer away from those comments, so good. We don't really like to have retain until no longer useful. We like to have a more specific period spelled out there. Perfect. Gold star for you, sir. If you're going to destroy something, just destroy it on your own time. Don't send it to us first. There should never really be transfer the archives and then destroy. It should be transfer the archives and then disposition should be archives, or else retain until no longer useful and then destroy. Correct. Okay, one more example. Employee training videotapes. I'm sorry for making you think so hard early this morning.
Especially since I didn't quite done it.
So I guess maybe it's the same thing as the last one. We're going to keep
Okay.
it, but if it's not accepted for transfer, then destroy it.
Okay.
So if you can destroy it, then why transfer to the other?
You will see this, yeah. You will see this sometimes frequently, that contact the archives for appraisal. Again, there's only Megan and me, so we like to spell out specific things about if you are sending it to us, spell out what you should be sending to us. We don't really like appraising things only because we don't have, the staff for that. There's one other thing.
Why do you have it, I don't like, I guess, the C comments and C comments.
Okay.
When there's retention and then the disposition, and we have to go to comments
Sure. Okay. The other thing that I was going to point out on this one is videotapes. I kind of assume that these records are no longer kept on videotapes. They're probably kept electronically. It's been almost 30 years since 1990, surprisingly. But that's just something that we would need to contact this agency about. And then the last one, audit reports. Is there anything weird with this? You guys have been doing fantastic, by the way. All right, no one said anything? That's the right answer. Again, surprisingly, they made a retention schedule in the 80s that made sense. But yeah, this one's completely fine. And then that's all I have, and Megan's going to talk to you guys about electronic records.
Is everybody awake? We all still good? Okay. Okay, so I just realized sitting down that we never actually really introduced ourselves and what our job titles are. Ethan is the government records archivist. Traditionally, that's been paper records, but more and more it's kind of everything because that's just the way business is done. My original job title was electronic records archivist. I'm now the senior archivist of public services, but I still maintain the electronic records role in my job. And what that means is basically I help advise agencies on how to deal with electronic records because we work so electronically anymore, but we don't really have a great plan in place. And a lot of places don't have a great plan for electronic records. So this is going to be pretty high level. It's going to be, you're going to walk away from this probably having more questions than answers, and that's typically how this works with electronic records. We do every single day. But we try and give some tips and tricks on how to deal with some of the bigger record series in terms of electronic records. So I'm going to talk a little bit about email. We'll talk a little bit about texts, all sorts of good stuff. But first, I just want to kind of talk about record keeping in a digital age and how the way we worked really has changed, but systems haven't kept up. This is a problem everywhere. It's not just at the city level. It's not just at the county level. It's not even just at the government level. It is in archives as well. The people who are tasked with keeping history preserved for the life of the Republic, we don't have a great answer for this yet, and it's because technology just hasn't kept up with the way we work. Systems are often funded, designed, and implemented without adequate thought for that long-term preservation. It's more reactionary to our current needs. So we have to think about records kind of the same way we think about paper, but what does that actually mean? What is the same? What's different? I always like to show this photo because this is a really good visual of the difference between paper and electronic for me. When you're looking at paper records, there's always that tangible thing in front of you, right? You have your file cabinet, and you can go in and you can pull a file out and hold it in your hands. But in a computer, you don't really know what's on your computer most of the time, unless you run inventory software on your computers daily. It's very hard to know what's on your computer. And I think that's the biggest difference between paper and electronic. Really, everything else is fairly similar. You're still going to have file structures. You're still going to have file naming standards, or you should. Things are still going to be kept, the same way that you keep paper. It's just knowing what you have is really where the difference lies. So these are some of the questions I get asked quite a bit, the first three anyways, about electronic records and my advice on them. It's what are electronic records? What does the state define as an electronic record? Ethan kind of covered that already. Where are they found? When I'm generating electronic records, where am I keeping these things? Where should I be keeping these things? And then how is maintaining and preserving them any different? And then I always try to answer those questions based on these last three things. These are the archival principles that we kind of weave in through those discussions and kind of give a broader understanding of what we do and what should be done with records. So classification and disposition, we've already talked about that, knowing what your records are and what you can do with them. Metadata and tagging gives you context for your records. Metadata is just data about data. So who is creating the record, usernames, dates, timestamps, all the stuff that happens behind the scenes in a software program that is associated with a file format. And then the last thing that I point out here, I probably should take this bullet point down, but As a trusted digital repository, that is an international standard for the archive profession. NASA developed this set of, I guess, it's a checklist. It's a giant, like 300-page long checklist of things that need to be accomplished before you can be considered a trusted digital repository. They're not meeting any of those things. I think there are 2 organizations in the entire world that are. But we talk about it because this is what we use as kind of the pie in the sky. If everybody had all the money in the world and we could do things right, this is how we would base things on. But we try and pull some of the most important things off of that checklist and talk about them. And you'll see some of that through the next few slides. So this slide is always fun. I always point this out. This is all of these things, or most of these things, are in my office right now. And I have to keep them, right? Because they are electronic records, and some of them I can access data off of. Most of them I can't anymore, but I still have to keep them because I don't know what's on them, and I can't point to a retention schedule that tells me I can destroy them. So I have boxes of obsolete formats that are problematic. So when you're thinking about your electronic records, just think about that. Do you have a migration plan in place? Are you going to save things in its native format, like Microsoft Word, or are you going to convert them to PDF if you're keeping things electronically? Those are things to think about. Microsoft goes through updates all the time, even though they said they haven't, or they're not going to anymore. I don't believe it. So at the archives, we've made the choice to save things as an archival version of PDF. Some common file types, they'll probably not surprise you on the left-hand side over there. Image files, you got your JPEGs, TIFFs. Email is a common file type now, which we'll talk more about, don't worry. Word processing, Excel, PDFs, things like that. But some uncommon things that I talk about as records that sometimes I get deer in headlight looks are things like databases. If you're using a database in your job, the data within that database is a public record and can be pulled for Cora. Texting files on your phones. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but they are public records per state statute. Web pages, if you're putting out public notices on a website, those are all public record and should be documented as such. And then any social media posts, GIS data, any kind of app data, those are all public record and can be pulled in any kind of Cora request as well. So some people, when they ask me, where should I be keeping these things? My answer you'll hear me say all the time that I don't know. Tell me about your stuff, right? Tell me about your situation. A lot of my job is really talking to agencies about what they can do rather than what they should do. Because the reality is not everybody can afford a fancy system. Not everybody can afford to put everything in the cloud. Not everybody can afford extra storage space on their servers. So these are some of the places that we've seen agencies keep stuff. I would prefer that places don't keep things on thumb drives, but it happens for backups in some cities and municipalities, some small government agencies. They have to do that as their only option. We see things kept on shared drives at the archives. We keep things on shared drives. That's our main operating environment. We do use our website to put out public information. And then we also store stuff in the cloud. Our digital repository, our trusted digital repository at the archives is cloud-based. Our storage is cloud-based, or partially cloud-based. So just kind of some things to think about there. The main thing that I point out here is, regardless of where you're storing stuff, it should still look the same, right? You should still have the same kind of file structure as you do in your file cabinet. It should still be named the same things that you would name a paper file. You should be able to pull somebody off the street, give them 10 minutes of training on your file structure, and they should be able to find a file pretty easily. That's not reality for a lot of places, but that's something to think about when you're creating office policies or retention schedules. Just thinking about those things, is it's really not that different than paper. Any questions? Everybody good still? Are you laughing? Because that's all yeah. That's all best case scenario, I know. So the next question I always inevitably get is, so what about email? And email's tricky, right? Because you get so much in your email, it's hard to put it under one umbrella. And you shouldn't be putting email under one umbrella. Email is a public record, but it's not your email inbox itself. It's individual emails that come into your inbox are public records. And so sometimes you'll have maybe 20 different series IDs that come into your email inbox, right? So you'll have permit files, complaint files, random spam, all of those things come into one location. You should really be treating those records separately and, follow your retention schedule for each individual one. It's hard to do, but that's the option we have, right? So retention schedules should be made for state and local agencies. Chances are they are, if you have a retention schedule already made. All organizations should have email retention policies, though, that supplement your retention schedules. So how you can be using your email, should people be using file folders, filters, things like that to help manage who has access to email if you're gone, things like that. So just kind of think through some of those things. Some tips that I like to talk about when talking about email management is using filters and folders to organize by subject is going to be crucial if you get a core request, and that discovery piece is that's the only way to do the discovery, right? If you are the kind of person that gets an email in your inbox and never puts it anywhere else, that's going to be problematic if you get a core request. And it's going to be problematic for you to do your job, right? Who wants to spend 20 minutes searching for an email that they received 2 weeks ago? I can't do that. That drives me crazy. If your system allows, use tags and flags to categorize things. We use Outlook at the Historical Society. We are on the state tenant for that. And so they have a tagging system that makes things fairly easy. We can color code things based on subject. I tag things from my boss with State Archivist so that if I need to find something that he sent me, I can just search in my inbox for State Archivist and all of his emails pop up, even if he wasn't the one that sent them. Retain emails per retention policy. Again, I know we kind of beat this into you, but if you don't have a retention schedule set up, you should not be deleting things because you don't really have the justification to do so. Any questions? I know that's not realistic. I know I just got a whole bunch of scared looks over here. It's okay. Chances are the general schedule that you guys can actually follow the general schedule for the county. There's a correspondence series ID in there. There's policy-related correspondence and general correspondence. We have set those up on the general schedule so that you can follow those, and that does include email if it's just regular correspondence. If it's a different kind of record series, then that's something else. But check that out. Call us if you have any questions. Does anybody have any questions about email?
Just want to make clear something.
Yeah.
That when you email with your attorney, that's attorney.
Sure. Yeah.
So just be careful thinking that when you are saving your emails, that's anything we want to give away. And anytime you get one of these requests, we want to talk about what we're giving away first, so we're not giving
Totally.
away privilege and that stuff. I know
Yeah.
there's a wide swath of things we have to give away and
Mhm.
that. But
Yeah.
we have a lot of conversations with our attorneys about
And that's a very good point. Sometimes we give these trainings with attorneys in the room, so I'm assuming you're city attorney? No? Just kidding. Never mind. City administrator. Okay. That makes sense. Yes. So if you do get a core request, always contact your attorney first. Don't try and do it yourself. And an attorney will tell you the exact same thing. There are certain things that are attorney-client privilege that are privileged. You don't have to release that to anybody. There are certain restrictions too. The core law allows for restrictions on certain records that your attorney will be able to answer those questions. So yes, good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions?
Just to add to that, so I guess I'm saying if you're involved in a very confidential discussion, it's a good idea to think about, hey, do I want to involve my attorney in this because it is a potential litigation thing. If you spray around emails, just remember that if you don't have attorney-client privilege,
Fair point.
I would just like to comment too that, since I've been here, we haven't, really had a lot of requests for records. But as we get bigger and as time has gone on, and I have found out that we do have more requests for records, and as clerk, I don't know about them, which is not necessarily something that's required, but, I've had a couple of conversations, and I think that we're going to start really, putting that more into a process, as opposed to just, oh yeah, respond and go on. That there'll be a process for, open records, which we probably should have been doing it all along, but when you don't get very many,
Mm-hmm.
but like I said, we are getting more and more, so just be watching out for that.
Any other questions? So we're going to talk a little bit about appraising records. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. So if you have any, okay, we'll leave some time at the end too if you do. This is kind of a weird place to put this, but we didn't really know where else to put this in the presentation. When we come out and do trainings for local agencies, we'd like to talk about appraising records a little bit because we don't, oftentimes for cities and municipalities, we don't have the opportunity to do this that much. And so we like to talk about what we consider when we're appraising stuff, and how we can help you make some of those decisions yourselves or find the resources to make some of those decisions yourselves. So this picture is a pretty good example of stuff that we see. We've seen state agencies with stuff like this. A lot of us have records stored somewhere in a room like this. This is more normal than you think. If your records look like this, don't freak out. It's okay. Like I said, we're not records police. We're not going to come and slap your hands. What we're going to do, though, is help you figure out a plan and figure out how to make it look better, right? And how to make it more accessible for you and for the public, because we're kind of here as an advocate for both. So what does appraisal even mean? Appraisal of government records is just determining their value and disposition. So if you're at the very beginning of your records management, developing that policy or checklist or whatever, this is your first step. You want to know what you have. So do you have things that you need to just get rid of immediately? How do I know that I can do that? Should things be retained and how long? Should they be transferred to an archives or like a local history center, or should they stay on site permanently if they have some historical significance? And then really you should be considering how many possible value types records can have, and we'll go through a few of them here in just a minute. Right now. So a few of these things, I thought there was some more slide in there, sorry. These are some of the types of value that we consider at the state archives. This is why we're he was trained as a historian, I'm trained as an archivist. But it's all the same stuff, right? We have to consider these kinds of value when we're putting things into classes, when we're deciding disposition types, and if we want to keep it at the archives. So a lot of things, the first place we always start is, does this have administrative value? This typically pertains to the origin of your office. It will show development of your office. It documents the activities and accomplishments of your agency. So it's really the stuff that is proof of those decision-making moments, right? So minutes, policies, and procedure manuals, things like that. Those all have long-term historical administrative value. Fiscal value, these are needed for audit purposes. It's usually the accounting records that help you develop audit or budget reports, ledgers, things like that. Annual budgets do have permanent historical value, but the stuff that you use to create them don't typically have permanent. They may have some long-term value, but it just depends on the record type. That's up to you as an agency to define that. But at the State Archives, we keep annual reports and annual budgets permanently, or we call it archives. Legal value, this is stuff that shows usefulness or significance of records to document and protect the rights and interests of people, right? So this is it's not just internal people, it's external people too. So these are things that can provide for defense and litigation. It's showing that you're complying with law. and you're meeting other legal needs. So these can be like contracts, naturalization papers, any kind of agreement that you have with the community, anything that you think, shows that you could use to help provide defense. These typically don't have historical value unless it's kind of a precedent-setting case. That's something that you'll hear quite a bit or see quite a bit on the state and local retention schedule. Precedent setting means it's the first of its kind. It's something that was just kind of wonky, and we keep that stuff as kind of an idea of how things were run during a case or whatever. So this one can go either way, right? This is probably the trickiest one to figure out if you are just starting out in this. I still have problems figuring out if something has historical value sometimes, which is why we have a team of people that help determine this at the state archives. These are things that document the development of government and its policies for public records. It's unique evidence though, right? It's like I said, annual reports, birth and death records, policy correspondence. It's those things that are going to provide a peek into government for the long term. It's things that people will probably come back and request and do research on later. It's not just what's listed here. There's a huge long list of stuff that we do keep at the Historical Society. But not everything has historical value is something that I want to point out as well. So not everything that you use to create annual reports is historically significant. The annual report is. Things like that. And finally, intrinsic value. So this is a little bit kind of squishy, I guess. It's not easy to put your thumb on this because sometimes you don't know if something has intrinsic value until after the fact. But these are things that have unique characteristics that make them interesting and worthy of retention, right? We have things from a certain time period just because of, it was the 60s and 60s were kind of tumultuous. So there are certain records we've kept from that to show just kind of how people communicated with each other. A coverage of a historical event, we have a small collection of, I think it's diary entries of school kids on September 11th, which is really interesting because it affected all of us. And we decided to keep that because that's a really good peek into a really big day. Things like signatures, where it's a boring document, but it's an incredible signature. We have a Lincoln letter that we would never keep it if an official signed something like this today because it's just totally routine, but Abraham Lincoln signed it, so it's in our collection. Bob Dole's a big one for us too. We have some Bob Dole signed stuff. So things like that. Problem with this is that sometimes you don't know at the city level, at the county level, if they're going to go on and do those big things, right? So understanding that is challenging in the moment. But if you're looking back on it, there may be some things that you have stored in a closet somewhere that have some intrinsic value just because of who signed it or who's touched it. So then when you've figured out what kinds of value your stuff has, you want to go through a process. You want it to be fairly organized. So the first step you want to do is just separate your records from your non-records. Keep track of your record series so you know what's where. And then collect key record information, where you found it, if it's an electronic record, who created it, what office it came out of. And then if you have any duplicates, weed those out. The state only requires one copy to be a record copy. Everything else is considered a convenience copy and can be deleted at any time. You want to group similar records together. Some of this seems pretty obvious. Create records retention schedules if you don't already have one, because again, you can't destroy anything until you have permission to do so. This one's pretty big for us at the archives, and if you can afford this and have time to do this, this is perfect. This is awesome. But rehouse the records. So banker's boxes are not acid-free. Acid-free is really big if you have paper because acid wears down on paper over time. So there are archival quality boxes that you can get for roughly the same price as banker's boxes. There are also acid-free folders that you can use as well. And then if you can, compile a detailed inventory of your records. Knowing what you have is half the battle. So some other things to consider when you're going through this is how much is it going to cost to process and preserve this? Is this even realistic to make up this plan and go through it in its entirety? Are you going to have to scale back some of this? Do you have an appropriate records retention schedule? Are you applying restrictions appropriately? So this is what we were kind of talking about before. There are certain restrictions to open records law that allows you to withhold some information from the public if it's protected. Those things are like social security numbers, all sorts of good stuff. And then what is the best format to store records? Is it electronic? Is it paper? Please don't do it on floppy disks. Somebody asked me that and it's ridiculous, but please don't. But just making those decisions and putting that in your policy as well is something to consider when you're starting this process out. So that is the end of our presentation. You have us captive for a little bit still. Do you have any questions for us? Yes, ma'am.
I came into my job 3 years ago, and I have a room that looks like that picture.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first started going through it, coming up with retention schedules and stuff, I saw somewhere that we were to keep old employee files like for 78 years after they left.
Yep, yep. That is based on federal employment law. That is something that we've vetted through Department of Administration, employment lawyers, and the State Records Board. So they felt comfortable. I can't, hold on just a second. I can pull it up.
Because I haven't been able to find it anywhere since, and so it was like, okay, did I really see that? Was it really that long?
So employee personnel files here. If you can read that, that's kind of wonky. But an employee personnel file should be kept, the full file needs to be kept the length of the employee's tenure plus 3 calendar years or 5 of as a contract employee. Then you create an abstracted work history. So it's things like appointment date, change of status, any kind of, anything that you think is important to know in that employee's file. Any kind of background check that you did, all that good stuff. You create or you retain those for 40 calendar years after the employee, after that initial 3 years after they were employed. So tenure plus 3 years. At the 3-year mark, create your abstracted work history. Then you have to keep that for 40 additional years. You're welcome. And it's got a really good, under the series ID, it tells you, it's a really good description of what an abstracted work history is. So if you want to take a peek at it, it's 0025-100. Anybody else? No? Alrighty, cool. Well, if you have the packet, you have our information. Feel free to email us. We are here to help. We're here for you. We are busy, but we're not ever too busy to answer questions. So please reach out to us. And yeah, thank you guys so much. You're welcome.